They thought forcing me to play piano at my sister's wedding was humiliation. They didn't know that was exactly the opportunity I'd been waiting for to change everything forever. My name is Elena Martinez, and for 23 years, I've been the shadow in my family's story, not by choice, but by design. See, in families like mine, there's always a golden child and a scapegoat. My sister Sophia got the golden crown. I got the leftover scraps of attention. Growing up, every family gathering was the same script. Sophia got straight A's again. Did you see Sophia's new boyfriend? Sophia's starting her own business at 21. Meanwhile, I'd sit in the corner with my piano books practically invisible. When I'd play something I'd been working on for months, Mom would nod absently and say, "That's nice, dear. Sophia, tell us more about your promotion." The pattern started early. When I was 8 and Sophia was 6, I begged our parents for piano lessons. They said we could only afford one child's activities, and Sophia had just started showing interest in business camp. Guess who got the lessons? Neither of us. But guess who got sent to that expensive business camp every summer? Not the kid who saved up her allowance to pay for her own piano books. By the time I was 16, I'd taught myself to read music and play everything from Bach to Billie Eilish. I dreamed of applying to Juilliard, but when I mentioned it at dinner, Dad actually laughed. Not a mean laugh, but the kind of laugh you give a child who says they want to be a unicorn when they grow up. Elena, honey, music is a nice hobby, but you need to think practically. Maybe accounting? You're good with numbers. So I did what scapegoat children do. I made myself useful in the background. When Sophia needed help with her college applications, I wrote 3 of her essays. When she wanted to start her boutique marketing business, I designed her entire website for free. When she complained that her college fund wasn't enough for her dream school, I quietly withdrew my community college fund and told my parents to give it to her instead. "You're so generous, Elena," Mom would say. Like my sacrifice was a personality trait instead of a survival mechanism. "Sophia's going places. You'll find your own way." And I did find my own way, just not the way they expected. While working part-time at a coffee shop to pay for community college, I enrolled in every online music theory course I could afford. While Sophia partied through business school, I practiced scales until my neighbors complained. While she built her Instagram following with lifestyle content, I quietly built something else entirely. But they didn't know about any of that. To them, I was still just Elena, the practical one, the helpful one, the one who kept the family running smoothly from the shadows, while Sophia shined in the spotlight. Then came David Harrison. If Sophia was golden, David was platinum. Old money family, trust fund, the kind of guy who summers in the Hamptons and winters in Aspen. When Sophia brought him home for the first time, I watched Mom transform into someone I barely recognized. Suddenly, our middle-class suburban home wasn't good enough. The family photos came down and got replaced with more sophisticated artwork. She started dropping names of charity galas she'd never attended and talking about art she'd seen once on Instagram. David was fine, polite, well-dressed, the kind of conventionally handsome that looks good in Christmas cards. But he had this way of looking through people he didn't consider important: service staff, retail workers, and apparently his future sister-in-law. In 2 years of family dinners, he'd probably spoken directly to me 5 times. The engagement happened exactly like a scene from a romantic comedy, except I was watching from the kitchen while doing dishes. Rose petals, string quartet, photographers capturing every angle. Sophia cried perfect tears that didn't smudge her makeup. Mom cried harder than the bride-to-be. I stayed in the kitchen until someone needed more champagne. Planning the wedding became Mom's full-time obsession. Every conversation at dinner revolved around venues, flowers, and guest lists. They'd spread magazines across the dining room table like battle plans, debating the social implications of different color schemes. "We need to make sure everything is perfect," Mom would say, highlighting another article about celebrity weddings. "The Harrisons are used to a certain level of sophistication." I'd learned not to offer opinions. The one time I suggested a song for the reception, Sophia wrinkled her nose and said, "Elena, this isn't a coffee shop playlist. We need real music." The sting lasted for days. The guest list grew to 200 people. I knew maybe 30 of them. The rest were David's family friends, business associates, and what Mom called important connections. She talked about the wedding like it was a business merger disguised as a celebration. 3 weeks before the wedding, Sophia cornered me in the living room with that smile she used when she wanted something. "Elena, I have the most perfect idea for the ceremony." I should have seen it coming. David's family loves classical music, like, seriously loves it. His grandmother is on the board of the symphony. So, I thought, wouldn't it be sweet if you played piano during the ceremony? Just something simple and elegant in the background while people are finding their seats. Background. There was that word again. Mom clasped her hands together like Sophia had just solved world hunger. "Oh, that's brilliant! Elena, you could play that pretty song you always practice? What's it called? The one that sounds like a movie?" She meant Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece that took me 3 years to master properly. But to her, it was just that pretty song. "I don't know," I said carefully. "The ceremony should be about you, not—" "Exactly," Sophia interrupted. "It would be perfect background music. Nothing too fancy or attention-grabbing. Just soft ambient music while the real ceremony happens." Background music. Like I was part of the decor. "Elena needs to know her place in all this," Mom added, not unkindly but with the matter-of-fact tone she used when discussing obvious truths. "She's not the spotlight person in the family. She's support staff, and there's nothing wrong with that." I stared at them both, these women who were supposed to love me unconditionally, and realized they genuinely couldn't see the insult they were delivering. To them, this wasn't humiliation. This was appropriate role assignment. "Fine," I said quietly. "I'll play." Sophia clapped her hands. "Perfect! Just something classical and boring. Nothing that'll distract from the important parts." If only they knew what I was really planning. The next morning, I sat at my old upright piano in my apartment, the one I'd bought used with coffee shop tips, and opened my laptop. For 3 years, I'd been keeping a secret that would have changed everything they thought they knew about me. While they saw failed potential and settled mediocrity, I'd been building something extraordinary. My YouTube channel, Anonymous Pianist, had 53,000 subscribers. I'd been posting weekly performances of everything from classical masterpieces to pop song arrangements, always filmed from behind so my face never showed. The comments section was full of people begging me to reveal my identity, to go professional, to record an album. I had a Patreon account that brought in enough money to pay my rent. But more than that, and this was the secret that would have killed them, I'd completed my bachelor's in music performance through an accredited online program, summa cum laude. While Sophia was posting selfies from business school parties, I was studying music theory, composition, and performance with professors who'd trained at conservatories around the world. Last month, I'd auditioned for the Metropolitan Opera's Young Artist program. The callback was scheduled for next week. I hadn't told my family about the audition, just like I hadn't told them about the degree, the YouTube channel, or the 3 different record labels that had reached out after hearing my work. Why? Because I'd learned that my family's love came with conditions. They loved the version of me that stayed small, stayed helpful, stayed in the background. The moment I became something larger than their limited vision could contain, I threatened their entire worldview. But Sophia's wedding was going to change all of that. I pulled up a blank document and started typing. The voice I never had. A song I'd been working on for months. It started innocently enough with classical chord progressions that would sound like appropriate wedding music. But halfway through, it transformed into something else entirely. A contemporary ballad about a woman finding her voice after years of being silenced. The lyrics were everything I'd never been allowed to say. "You built your castle on my silence, made your throne from my small dreams, but every whisper you've ignored just made my song grow stronger." It was beautiful. It was heartbreaking. And it was going to destroy their perfect wedding narrative completely. For the next 2 weeks, I practiced obsessively. Not just the piano arrangement, but the vocal performance too. My voice, trained through years of online lessons and practice, had developed into something I barely recognized from my shy teenage years. Rich, powerful, emotionally devastating when I wanted it to be. Sophia texted me daily with reminders about keeping the music simple and background appropriate. Mom called to suggest I wear something plain so I wouldn't draw attention from the bride. David didn't acknowledge I existed. They had no idea what was coming. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful because of course it did. Even the weather was cooperating with Sophia's perfect vision. I arrived at the venue 3 hours early, ostensibly to set up the piano, but really to prepare mentally for what I was about to do. The Belmont estate was exactly the kind of place where David's family felt comfortable. All marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and oil paintings of dead white men. The ballroom could hold 300 people comfortably, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking manicured gardens. At the far end of the room, they'd positioned a baby grand piano in the corner, away from the altar, away from the main sightlines, positioned so the pianist would be background decoration rather than featured performer. Perfect. I ran through a few warm-up pieces, my fingers reacquainting themselves with keys that responded more sensitively than my old upright at home. The acoustics were incredible. Every note rang clear and true, filling the space with sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Elena!" Mom's voice echoed across the empty ballroom. She clicked across the marble in heels that cost more than my monthly car payment, wearing a dress she'd bought specifically to impress David's mother. "Oh, good, you're here early. Remember, nothing too loud or flashy. We want elegant background music, not a concert." "I understand perfectly," I said, and meant it in ways she couldn't imagine. Guests began arriving an hour before the ceremony. I watched from my corner position as the ballroom filled with people who moved through wealth like it was the air they breathed. Women in designer dresses that cost more than most people's cars. Men in suits tailored so perfectly they looked painted on. David's family held court near the front of the room. His grandmother, Mrs. Eleanor Harrison, was exactly what you'd expect from someone on the symphony board. Silver hair in an elegant chignon, posture that suggested decades of finishing school, and an air of cultural authority that made people gravitate toward her opinions about art and music. I'd done my research. Mrs. Harrison hadn't just donated money to the arts. She'd been a music student herself once, before marriage and social expectations redirected her talents toward patronage instead of performance. She would recognize real talent when she heard it. David's father talked loudly about business ventures and golf handicaps. His mother discussed charity galas and interior designers. They were nice enough people, I supposed, but they inhabited a world where culture was something you consumed rather than created, where art was something you hung on walls or listened to at approved venues. My family clustered together near the middle of the room, visibly trying to fit in. Mom had coached Dad on which fork to use for each course and reminded him 3 times not to talk about his job at the hardware store. They looked uncomfortable in clothes they'd bought specifically for this event, like actors who'd memorized their lines but weren't quite sure about their blocking. Sophia was radiant, I had to admit. Her dress was a work of art, all silk and beadwork that caught the light like captured starlight. She moved through the room like she'd been born to this level of luxury, accepting compliments and well wishes with practiced grace. She didn't look in my direction once. As the ceremony start time approached, guests began taking their seats. The background music was my cue, 30 minutes of elegant, unobtrusive piano music while people settled in and conversations gradually quieted to appropriate whispers. I started with Pachelbel's Canon in D, because what else do you play at a wedding when you want to be safe and predictable? The familiar melody filled the room, pretty and forgettable as wallpaper. Conversations continued, people checked their phones. A few guests near the piano nodded appreciatively, but mostly I was part of the atmosphere, like the flowers or the lighting. Exactly what they wanted. I moved through a carefully curated playlist of crowd pleasers. Bach's Air on the G string, Debussy's Clair de Lune, Chopin's Minute Waltz, all pieces that sounded impressive to people who didn't know much about classical music but were safe enough not to upstage the main event. 20 minutes into my performance, I noticed Mrs. Harrison had moved closer to the piano. She stood with a glass of champagne, her attention focused on my hands rather than the social conversations around her. When I finished the Chopin piece, she gave a small nod of approval. She knew I was good, really good. She just didn't know yet how good. The wedding party began their procession as I transitioned into traditional wedding march variations. bridesmaids in dusty rose silk, groomsmen in charcoal gray suits, everyone moving in the practiced choreography of wealthy weddings. Then Sophia appeared in the doorway, radiant and perfect, and the room collectively held its breath. This was her moment, the culmination of months of planning and a lifetime of being the center of attention. I played her down the aisle with a gentle arrangement of Mendelssohn's Wedding March, watching as 200 guests stood and turned their cameras toward the bride. She practically glowed with happiness and satisfaction. The ceremony itself was elegant and predictable. Traditional vows, readings from 1 Corinthians about love, an exchange of rings that probably cost more than my car. I provided soft background music throughout, invisible and appropriate. But as the ceremony concluded and guests began to applaud the new Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, I prepared for the moment that would change everything. The reception was supposed to begin with cocktails and mingling while the wedding party took photos. This was traditionally when the ceremony musicians packed up and the DJ took over. Instead, I stayed at the piano. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sophia's voice came through the sound system as she stood with her new husband near the head table. "Before we begin the reception, I'd like to thank everyone who made this day special, including my sister Elena, who provided beautiful music for our ceremony." A polite smattering of applause. A few people looked around to locate the piano player they'd barely noticed. "Elena's going to play one more song as her wedding gift to David and me, something she composed especially for today." I saw the exact moment when Sophia realized she'd made a mistake. She'd assumed I would play something safe and brief, then disappear so the real party could begin. Her smile faltered slightly as she looked at me, still seated at the piano, my hands positioned over keys that suddenly felt like weapons. "This song," I said, speaking clearly enough for my voice to carry across the room without amplification, "is called The Voice I Never Had." I began with the classical progression I'd planned, something that sounded like it belonged in the same musical universe as everything else I'd played that day. Guests relaxed, turning back to their conversations and champagne. But 30 seconds in, something changed. The melody shifted into a minor key, becoming something haunting and complex. My left hand found a rhythm that was more contemporary than classical, while my right hand began weaving a melody that was unmistakably original. Conversations began to quiet. The music built slowly, layering harmonies that most people couldn't identify but everyone could feel. This wasn't background music anymore. This was a composition that demanded attention, that pulled focus like gravity. And then I began to sing. The first note that came from my throat silenced the room completely. My voice, trained through years of secret lessons and countless hours of practice, filled the ballroom with a power that none of them had ever heard from me before. Rich, clear, and emotionally devastating, it cut through conversations and forced every head to turn toward the corner where I sat at the piano. "You built your castle on my silence, made your throne from my small dreams, but every whisper you've ignored just made my song grow stronger." I watched faces transform as the lyrics registered. Guests who had been checking their phones now stared openly. David's business associates, who probably thought wedding entertainment was something to endure politely, leaned forward in their chairs. But it was Mrs. Harrison's reaction that told me everything I needed to know. The elderly woman had moved closer to the piano, her champagne glass forgotten in her hand, her eyes wide with recognition of what she was witnessing. This wasn't just good. This was exceptional. Professional level exceptional. "Behind your golden chosen child, I learned to make myself so small, but small things grow in darkness until they're too big to ignore at all." Sophia's smile had completely vanished. She stood frozen next to David at the head table, her bouquet trembling slightly in her grip. This wasn't what she'd planned. This wasn't background music. This was her wedding reception being hijacked by her invisible sister. Mom's face had gone pale. She gripped Dad's arm, her knuckles white, as she realized that everyone in the room was staring at me, really seeing me, for the first time in her memory. "I gave you every sacrifice you asked me for and more, kept myself so quiet that you forgot what I was fighting for, but tonight I'm done with whispers. Tonight I'm done with staying small. Tonight you'll hear the voice you tried so hard to stall." My voice soared on the chorus, hitting notes that rang crystal clear in the ballroom's perfect acoustics. Phones came out, not for casual social media posts, but to record something extraordinary happening in real time. I could see people in the back of the room standing up to get a better view. The professional musicians scattered throughout the guest list, because people like the Harrisons always had artists and patrons at their events, were exchanging glances of genuine amazement. I caught sight of a woman in an elegant black dress whom I recognized from my research. Sarah Chin, a talent scout for Columbia Records who'd attended as David's aunt. "You taught me I was background music, something pretty but not too loud, but background music sets the mood for everything, and I'm done playing for your crowd." As the song built toward its climax, I let my voice show its full range and power. Years of technical training combined with raw emotion created something that made people hold their breath. This wasn't just revenge. This was revelation. The final notes hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment the ballroom was completely silent. 200 people, all holding their breath, all staring at the girl they'd barely noticed sitting in the corner. Then Mrs. Harrison started clapping. Not polite wedding applause, the kind of clapping you give at concert halls when you've witnessed something remarkable. Within seconds, others joined in, and within 10 seconds, the entire ballroom was on their feet. The standing ovation lasted 47 seconds. I know because I counted every one of them, watching as my family's carefully constructed narrative crumbled in real time. People rushed toward the piano like I was giving autographs at a concert. Mrs. Harrison reached me first, her face flushed with excitement. "My dear girl," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades evaluating talent. "That was extraordinary. Where did you train? Who's your voice coach? Are you performing professionally?" Before I could answer, Sarah Chin appeared at Mrs. Harrison's shoulder, business card already in her hand. "Elena, right? Sarah Chin, Columbia Records. I need to talk to you immediately. That song, did you write that? The composition is incredible, but your voice?" She shook her head in amazement. "We need to schedule a meeting, this week." More people crowded around. A man in an expensive suit introduced himself as Marcus Webb, artistic director of the Portland Opera. A woman with silver hair pressed her card into my hand, explaining that she managed several Grammy-winning artists. Everyone wanted to know the same things. Where had I come from? Why hadn't they heard of me before? Was I available for bookings? Through the crowd, I caught glimpses of my family. Mom stood near the head table, her mouth slightly open, still processing what had just happened. Dad looked confused but proud, like he wasn't sure exactly what he'd witnessed, but knew it was important. And Sophia? Sophia looked like someone had just told her that gravity was optional. David's reaction was almost as interesting as his family's. While his new wife stood frozen in shock, he was actually smiling. Not the polite, social smile he usually wore, but something that looked almost like genuine appreciation. When he caught my eye across the crowd, he nodded once, a gesture that felt like acknowledgement of something he'd never seen before. "Elena," Mrs. Harrison called over the din of conversations. "You must come to dinner next week. I'm hosting a small gathering for the Philharmonic's board members, and they absolutely must hear you perform." Sarah Chin was more direct. "Seriously, I'm not leaving this wedding without scheduling a recording session. What you just did, that's not amateur hour. That's the kind of talent that changes careers overnight." For 23 years, I'd been starving for this kind of recognition. Not just applause, but understanding. These people, strangers who knew music, who understood talent, saw something in me that my own family had missed completely. I spent the next hour in a receiving line I'd never planned, shaking hands with people who wanted to offer me opportunities I'd only dreamed about. By the time the crowd around the piano finally dispersed, my purse was full of business cards, my phone had 3 new recording offers, and my YouTube subscriber count had jumped by 15,000 people who'd found my channel through the videos they'd posted of my performance. But the most satisfying moment came when the last well-wisher walked away and I finally had a chance to look directly at my family. Mom approached first, her steps hesitant, like she was walking toward a stranger. "Elena, I had no idea you could sing like that. When did you learn to—" Her voice trailed off as she realized the implications of her own question. "I've been singing for years, Mom, taking lessons, practicing, performing online." "You never asked." She blinked rapidly, processing information that didn't fit her understanding of who I was supposed to be. "But the piano—" "We knew you played piano." "I have a bachelor's degree in music performance, summa cum laude. I've been accepted to the Metropolitan Opera's Young Artist program. My YouTube channel has over 50,000 subscribers." Each fact hit her like a physical blow. "Why didn't you tell us?" she whispered. The question hung in the air between us, loaded with years of history. "Because," I said quietly, "you never wanted to hear it. You needed me to be small so Sophia could be big. You needed me to be practical so she could be the dreamer. You needed me to be background music so she could be the star." Sophia finally found her voice. She pushed through the lingering crowd around the piano, her wedding dress rustling with agitation. "You ruined my wedding!" The words came out sharp and desperate. "This was supposed to be my day, and you made it all about you." "I played one song," I said calmly. "One song you asked me to play as my gift to you." "That wasn't a gift, that was sabotage. You knew exactly what you were doing." Her voice was getting louder, drawing attention from guests who'd been pretending not to eavesdrop. David appeared at his bride's shoulder, his hand gentle but firm on her arm. "Sophia, maybe we should discuss this privately." "No!" She shook him off, her composure finally cracking completely. "She's always done this, always found ways to make everything about her. Even when she's being helpful, she's really just trying to show off." The accusation was so far from reality that I almost laughed. Show off? I'd spent 2 decades making myself invisible. "You want to know what I was really doing?" I asked, standing up from the piano bench. "I was giving you exactly what you asked for. Background music that sets the mood for everything. The only difference is you never bothered to ask what kind of mood I was setting." Mrs. Harrison, who'd been listening from a respectful distance, stepped forward. "I'm sorry, but I have to interject," she said in her authoritative voice. "Elena, dear, what you just performed was the most beautiful wedding gift I've witnessed in 40 years of attending society weddings. If your sister can't appreciate the magnitude of talent you just shared with all of us, that speaks to her character, not yours." The public rebuke from David's grandmother, delivered with the kind of social authority that could end careers in their world, left Sophia speechless. But the real transformation was happening around us as the reception continued. Word of my performance had spread beyond the ballroom. Videos were already circulating on social media. I could see people throughout the party watching clips on their phones, then looking toward me with new interest. 3 months later, my debut album topped the classical crossover charts. 6 months later, I was performing at Lincoln Center. A year later, I won a Grammy for Best Classical Performance by a new artist. But the most important change happened that night, in the car driving home from Sophia's wedding. I sat in my apartment later, still in my simple black dress, scrolling through the hundreds of messages that had flooded my phone. Record label offers, booking requests, interview opportunities, collaboration invitations. My YouTube channel had gained 20,000 new subscribers in 6 hours. The video of my wedding performance had been shared so many times that Elena Martinez Pianist was trending on Twitter. My phone rang. Mom's contact photo filled the screen. I almost didn't answer. "Elena?" Her voice was small, uncertain. "Are you there?" "I'm here. I've been thinking about what you said tonight, about us never asking." She paused, and I could hear her crying. "You're right. We never asked. We just assumed we knew who you were, and we were wrong about everything." I waited. "I don't know how to fix this," she continued. "I don't know how to take back 23 years of not seeing you properly." "You can't," I said, not cruelly but honestly. "But you can start seeing me now." "Will you give us a chance to try?" I looked around my apartment, at my piano, my music books, my laptop where I'd built a career they'd never known existed. This space represented years of creating myself in secret, building something beautiful out of their neglect. "I don't need you to validate me anymore, Mom. I found that validation myself." But if you want to actually know who I am, the real me, not the version you needed me to be, then yes, we can try." The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours. For the first time in my life, my mother asked me real questions about my dreams, my fears, my accomplishments, my plans. She listened to my songs, watched my YouTube videos, cried when she realized how much talent she'd dismissed as nice hobby music. Sophia and I didn't speak for 6 months. When we finally did, it was at Mom's birthday dinner, and the dynamic had permanently shifted. I was no longer the family's background music. I was the success story, the talented one, the daughter who'd surprised everyone. She apologized eventually. Not for the wedding, she still insisted I'd deliberately upstaged her special day, but for years of treating me like her supporting character instead of the protagonist of my own story. "I always thought you were okay with it," she said during that awkward birthday dinner conversation. "Being the helpful one, the quiet one. You never complained." "I was never okay with it," I replied. "I just knew that complaining wouldn't change anything." David, interestingly, became an unexpected ally. Away from the social pressures of his family's world, he revealed himself to be someone who genuinely appreciated talent and authenticity. He started coming to my performances, sometimes bringing Sophia, sometimes alone. He never made it about him or his connections. He just listened to the music. "I never really saw you before that night," he admitted after one of my concerts. "I'm sorry about that. I was so focused on fitting into what I thought your family wanted that I missed who you actually were." The Metropolitan Opera Young Artist Program turned out to be everything I dreamed and more. 2 years later, I made my Met debut in La Boheme. Mrs. Harrison attended every performance, bringing different board members each night to discover the remarkable young talent she'd found at a wedding. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came 3 years after Sophia's wedding, when I was invited to perform at the wedding of David's younger brother. This time, I wasn't background music tucked in a corner. I was the featured entertainment, with a spotlight and a wireless microphone, performing a set I'd chosen myself. My family sat in the front row, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They clapped loudly after every song, their faces bright with pride and genuine appreciation for what I'd built. After the reception, as I was packing up my equipment, Sophia approached me alone. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice quieter than I'd heard it in years, "about that night at my wedding, what you said about background music setting the mood for everything." I waited, curious where she was going with this. "You were right," she continued. "You were always setting the mood for our family, making everything work, keeping everything peaceful, supporting everyone else's dreams. We just never realized that background music is what makes everything else possible." She paused, then smiled. Not the practiced social smile I remembered, but something more genuine. "I'm glad you finally decided to step into the spotlight where you belonged all along." As I drove home that night, I thought about the girl who'd sat in the corner of that ballroom 4 years earlier, invisible and underestimated, with a secret that would change everything. She'd been patient, she'd been strategic, and when the moment came, she'd been ready. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait for exactly the right moment to show people who you really are. And sometimes that moment comes when they least expect it, in front of people who matter, when the stakes are highest and the spotlight is brightest. They wanted background music. I gave them a symphony. And that's when they realized I was never meant to be in the background at all. I was always the lead in my own story. I just had to wait for the right song to prove it.